My parents were Eugene Dorman and Naomi Dorman. My mother, her maiden name was Castile. She was a full-blooded Swede, and when her grandparents moved to Iowa from Sweden, there were so many Carlsons and Johnsons and Swansons, and that the grandparents changed their name to Castile so the mail wouldn't get mixed up in Iowa. Well, they were in the farming business, but an important business that they were engaged in was a business called an apple evaporating business. And this business belonged first to my mother and her first husband, and it was known as the Smith Evaporating Company. In fact, I think I even remember my mother saying that they were listed in the Dun and Bradstreet book on the New York Stock Exchange. It was a big business during the time because it provided food. It provided dried apples for people, and they could be shipped all over the United States. It provided a market for the people who grew apples in the region. It provided work for people who needed work. And then when my mother's first husband died, and later she married my father after his first wife died, she told a real funny story about what was going on in the neighborhood at that time. All the neighbors took a keen interest in whether or not Eugene Dorman would marry Naomi Smith or whether she would marry Mrs. Harriman. And my mother would often say, well, Izetta Gibson popped up all the popcorn in Bethel Grove trying to get your father to marry Mrs. Harriman, but he chose me. So in the operating business, I can return to that, my mother and my father continued to operate the apple evaporating business, but it soon closed, and then they were just involved in producing fruit, apples, grapes, peaches, strawberries. And strawberries were very important to me because I loved the strawberry season, playing in the strawberry patches and picking strawberries. And I did that because my parents wanted me to learn how to work. And they paid me just like they paid the hands. And I saved some of the money to buy fireworks for 4th of July, but I also spent money on the way home from the strawberry patch to our home. There was a country store that was located between the place where the strawberries were grown and the place where we lived, and I always looked forward to stopping there and getting a big cold RC Cola and a candy bar with some of the money that I made. So I also helped, cut grapes, and I helped paste labels on the lids of the grape baskets that my father sold his grapes in. He sold table grapes. He grew Moore's Early, and the labels that were Moore's Early were clearly labeled Moore's Early, and those labels had to be pasted to the lids on the grape baskets. And he grew Concord grapes, and he had labels for Concord grapes as well. And the labels had the name Farmington. I believe they had Farmington, Arkansas on them. And I know they had his name stamped on them, so the people who bought them knew where they were getting them and who grew them. As far as making money, I can remember one time Mother and Daddy let me have the side shed of the barn to bottle feed a calf when I was in junior high. And that's when those big, long skirts, what were they called? We wore bobby socks, and we wore these big, long felt skirts. I think they were called poodle skirts, but I didn't buy one that had a poodle on them. I bought one that was a little bit nicer, and I got it at Camel and Bell's on the department store on the square. But I saved up my money. I bottle fed the calf, and I saved up my money, and I bought that poodle skirt. And I think I made $20, and at that time I spent $20 for that skirt, and that was a lot. But I've always enjoyed nice clothing, and I've always chosen to spend money on nice clothes rather than some other things I could spend money on. And I did other things. I worked other jobs on the farm, but that was the one I remember them paying me for. I didn't routinely get paid, except if I was working in the hand with the field hands, I would get paid what they got paid. But as far as other chores I did, like when they had dairy cattle, and there was a chore I remember because it was every day I had to do it. I had to carry water from the hydrant in the backyard to a big barrel in the front yard. I think it was made out of wood, a wooden barrel in the front yard, because that's where the milkman would come by for the milk. Well, they milked the cows, they strained the milk into the milk cans, and then they would put the milk cans in the cool water from the well that I had to carry from the hydrant in the backyard because there was none in the front yard. We had a gasoline-powered engine that pumped water from our well into a big tank that served all of our water needs, whether it was on the farm or in the house, because we did have plumbing in the house. But we didn't have it in the front yard, so I had to carry the water to the front yard because that's where the pet milk, we sold milk to the pet milk company, and the pet milk people would send a truck out and they would pick up the milk, and then we had to keep the milk cool in the water that I would carry to the front yard. I grew up in Bethel Grove. The school soon consolidated, the Bethel Grove school soon consolidated with Farmington, so we were involved with the Farmington school. My father was really involved with the Farmington school when he worked to save the school from consolidation in the maybe 1947, 48 year. I can't remember exactly. The Bethel Grove school had completely consolidated with Farmington during this time, and the Farmington school was told that they would have to consolidate with Fayetteville unless they could meet the required enumeration. So my father worked not only in the city of Farmington, but throughout all the district, which included other rural schools that had consolidated with Farmington, and I'll see if I can name them. Of course, Bethel Grove, Walnut Grove, Highland, White Rock, and Savoy. I think I've named them all. So he went throughout the area that included the Farmington School District and got the census that was required to keep the school. And we were all very proud, you know, of the fact that he took the time to do that. And I think many people in the community were proud as well. Proud that the school was going to stay. But then in the late 1960s, early 70s, consolidation came up again. But this time it didn't have anything to do with the census. It had to do with financial problems and some sentiment in the community that the school should go to Fayetteville. But again, there were members in the community as well as my family that felt that the financial problems could be solved and that the school should remain. And again, it did remain. We worked through it as a community. So now when I graduated from school in 1958, there were 7 in the graduating class. In 2017, the Farmington schools graduated, I think, 178 students. When my mother played basketball, the court was divided into 3 parts. Yes, but when I played basketball, the girls' court was divided into two parts, and we could only dribble twice. So I think, you know, there was maybe the thought that girls weren't physically able to dribble more than twice. But I think if you go see the Ladybacks play at the University of Arkansas, you would understand that they can dribble and dribble and dribble. I remember White's grocery store, and that Barn White owned that store, and he had served as mayor of Farmington, I think, for some time. I think I'm right about that. And then there was the McNeil's grocery store, and my mother used to say that Mrs. McNeil, that owned the grocery store, had a milliner's shop in the back of that store and would sell hats. That's what she used to say about that store. And then there was the Giles grocery store later on the corner of 170 and 62 Highway that went through Farmington. And I can remember my father stopped in there one time and talked to Mr. Giles. And Mr. Giles said to my father, well, Mr. Dorman, whatever happened to all the old people? And he said, Mr. Giles, we are the old people. I began school when I was 5 years old, and I would turn 6 then in October. And I loved school. I loved my friends. I can remember, one thing I remember about the Bethel Grove School is that we pumped water from a well in the back of the school, and I remember it was exciting when it came my turn to get to pump the water into the bucket and bring the bucket of water into the schoolhouse. And we began to learn about health and drinking after each other. And I remember that dipper in the water bucket. I was thinking, am I going to get germs if I drink out of that dipper and everybody else is drinking out of that dipper? You know, we all shared the same dipper. And my teacher was Lena Bell Beckett. Of course, I loved her. She lived, the home where she lived, she had to go past our home to get to Bethel Grove to teach, and she would often stop and pick me up. So Mother wouldn't have to take me down there. You know, there were no school buses that ran to the Bethel Grove school. You either had to walk or your parents took you, or in my case, my teacher stopped and got me. And I remember Lena Bell really well. I often visited with her in later years after I was much older and she was much older. I stopped to see her. The friends I remember were Mary Lee Davis, whose parents, Richard and Henrietta Davis, rented the store building from my parents and ran the general store that existed in Bethel Grove at that time. Mary Lee Davis, Jeannie Doms, Willie Mae Stapleton. I also went to church with the Stapleton girls and with Jeannie and Willie Mae, and then Willie Mae's sister, Wanda Lee Stapleton. I remember that I can't really remember the names of other children. There was a boy named Gilbert Perkins and a boy named Gerald Clayton. He had an older brother, Harold Clayton, that was a friend of my brother Herbert's. But I remember feeling like it was just a grand place to be, although looking back at the pictures, I don't think it was very grand. I remember that it was that year that the school, when the school consolidation issue came up, and my father worked to complete the census to keep the school. That was him. And I remember in 3rd grade I was chosen as we had a Halloween carnival, and we always had a king and queen of the Halloween carnival. And I was chosen in 3rd grade to be a candidate for the queen. And I was still trying to get things figured out at that time in my life. And I remember asking my mother, well, how do you get to be the queen? I'm just the candidate. And she'd say, well, you get votes. I said, you get votes? How do you get votes? Well, it's a penny a vote. See, they did that to raise money for the school. They had that event to raise money. And I still couldn't figure out why people would pay for votes. It just didn't add up to me. But I don't think I was the queen of the carnival that year, but I did get to be a candidate. And I can remember that my mother were still heavily involved in producing apples, and they would store apples in a cold storage plant we called it the locker, cold storage plant because we had a locker there where we would take meats to be frozen, but they also just had cold storage, like refrigerated storage, and Daddy would store baskets of apples for us to eat on all winter in the cold storage at the cold storage plant on West Street in Fayetteville. And for my birthday, they had checked with my teacher, Mrs. Perry, Marcella Perry, if they could bring a basket of apples and share them with my third grade class. And I was really proud when they walked in that back door of that old school room over there at the school. That part of the school's been tore down, but with the apples. So I remember my teachers. I just loved school. I didn't have any problems. Oh my goodness, my friends were Nell Williams, who lived over on Highway 16 West, Carolyn Sue, I want to say McDonald, that's her married name, Carolyn Sue, and then there was Dolores Mays, there was Mary Lee Davis, she was my friend in first grade, still my friend, and we played basketball, we had, parents would sponsor parties. One time my parents sponsored a weenie roast out in our backyard, and all the girls came and they got to be part of a bunking party, and the boys came and they got to be part of the party, but they didn't get to be part of the bunking party. Then there were hay rides. We had hay rides. And what did I do for fun? I read, I played games, I could entertain myself with a jumping rope, or I could play Monopoly with my neighborhood girlfriends. I could go swimming at the swimming hole. We had a swimming hole down at the Illinois River that was 2 miles west of our house. And after I learned to swim and learned to drive a car, my mother would let me take the car and go swimming. And I would stop and pick up neighborhood friends, and we would go to the swimming hole, and it was a great adventure to go down there all by ourselves. But we were safe. It was safe to do things like that, to allow your children to do things like that back then. If you could swim, you could go swimming. You know, you didn't have to worry about anything else happening. So that was fun. My parents, what they would do for fun, you see, my parents were so old when I was born, and if they talked about that, I don't remember. Well, I just feel like I belong there, and I feel like the people who move here feel like they belong here, even though they haven't lived here all their life like I have. Now that's an odd observation, but I have grown to know a lot of the people who have moved here through the Methodist Church over at Farmington that I belong to. And they're really nice people. And I don't look at them as outsiders. I feel like they belong here. Maybe that's an attitude of mine. I don't know. People are friendly. I don't feel like they're snobbish. I think there's a strong middle class in this community. I don't think the people in this community feel like there's an upper crust and a lower crust, and then nobody fits in the middle. You're either in the upper crust or the lower crust. I think there's a strong middle class in this community, and I think it possesses very healthy values that are accepting, that say it's okay if others come and they are welcome, values that we live by, values of honesty. We're straightforward. We love others and welcome them, I think. But maybe that's me. I don't know. Maybe others don't feel that way. My favorite thing about Farmington is that it's my home. I live on the north half of the 40 acres on which I was born. I don't know how to live anywhere else. I love the sunsets. I love the horizons. I love the people here. The people here are my friends. They, the men who are in their 50s, approaching 60s, went to school with my oldest daughter. And they live in this community, and if I need them, they come running. I mean, that's a treasure.